Welcome to mini lecture number 4 in 7503 NSE Aviation Economics. This lecture we're going to be dealing with operating costs, drivers, metrics and productivity. Whereabouts does this fit in? Well, think back to the very first lecture where I showed you that diagram showing the cost of a ticket being $224.40 and yet the profit was remarkably small. And we spoke about the service price offer in the previous lecture. What we're going to be doing in this lecture is talking about the way in which operating costs and their drivers affect the way that the airline operates. That is, if you can get your costs down, then your profit is obviously going to go up. But airlines need to measure this, and we spoke about John Borghetti always chasing down the metrics for Virgin Australia to find out how it's going. And we'll be looking at productivity and how this helps make one airline use its assets much better than another airline. For example, if you can turn your aircraft around in 30 minutes and it takes your competitor 50 minutes, then you've got a productivity edge on your competitor. So what we're going to be looking at in this is, first of all, the terminology used for airline market measurement and the interpretation and comparison. We're going to be looking at airline operating costs, the revenues, productivity, sources, the data that's gathered. We're going to take a look at the methods and challenges in categorising these operating costs, because trying to pin down exactly where a cost, for example, the person who works in the back room supporting the IT that supports your passenger reservation system, how do they contribute to your bottom line? We'll look at breakdown and comparison of aircraft operating costs for different operations. We'll look at all the other cost categories, their sources, their drivers, how they can be interpreted, how they compare, common measures and trends for aircraft and employee productivity that the airline industry uses, and also we'll be using graphical data right throughout the lecture. So this lecture covers a fair amount, and obviously in this mini lecture we can only touch upon that, but we'll be doing a lot that makes this lecture particularly interesting. Why use cost and revenue analysis? Hey, it's pretty self-explanatory, isn't it? We saw it in that first lecture. If your profit's so small, you've got to make sure your cost is staying well below what you're actually charging for your tickets. Because if you don't, you're going to be losing money. And plenty of airlines have gone out of business because they haven't done that. So the thing is that airlines look at aircraft as purely revenue generating assets. That is, they haven't got any special attraction to the airline other than something that earns money for them. It's virtually an airborne truck or an airborne bus in another way. Airlines, especially those with strong bargaining positions, are no longer willing to say, well, we provide a great service, but it costs a lot. They are taking a look and saying, how can we get that cost down without affecting the service? And we'll look at some of the things they look at. We know that airline strategists see a linkage between their capital and its potential as revenue earners. That is, if we've got too much money invested in our maintenance operation, might we be better to go out and outsource that? These are the sort of questions that airlines are looking at. That is, how is every dollar that we have, how is that earning revenue for us? And are we using our money in the best way possible? And of course, the one thing we know is costs have got to be understood as to where their sources are and how they can be attributed, because you need to know where every dollar is going to in your costs and as to how that can be possibly reduced, but in a way where your services stay the same or in fact improve. So in fact we go into just a little bit of accounting and terminology so that we can understand this. Now we come to the first of the metrics. And of course, we'll be doing quite a few metrics in this actual lecture, and we'll just touch on a few in this mini lecture to give you a feel. But for example, we'll be taking a look at the concept of yield. Whenever you read articles in airline economics or about airlines, they're talking about the yield itself. And this is a measure of the average fare paid by all passengers flown per kilometre. And so it's simply worked out by getting the total revenues and dividing it by the number of revenue passenger kilometres, because obviously we know that the longer the flight, the greater the amount of RPK. And of course we'll be showing as to how to work out revenue passenger kilometres and revenue passenger miles. We'll be taking a look at output done in available seat kilometres, that is, how many seats are you actually making available. And also we'll be taking a look at the unit cost, or the cost per air seat kilometre, or the cost per air seat mile, depending on which metric we're actually operating in. For example, North America tends to use air seat miles, whereas Europe and most of the world is talking about air seat kilometres. But the one thing that we find in this course is, because the United States provides so much data on their airlines, we tend to have a little bit of a bias towards the North American airlines, simply because that's where the data is available that helps us to understand and study our airlines more. But when you do your assignments, you can pick an airline from your own country and you'll find that a certain amount of the data will be available. But the United States provides a lot of data that helps us to understand the concepts. We'll be taking a look at the basic airline profit equation, and that is, profit is the revenues we bring in minus our operating expenses. We spoke about that in lecture 1, and we find out as to how we can actually calculate that. And we'll be doing that right throughout the course. We'll be taking a look at load factors and how we can calculate that, and how we can calculate it across a number of legs that an airline might fly on a particular route, so that we get the average load factor. Of course, the one thing that we find is that to study this, we have to find out some of the terminology that's used. And we find we get terms such as the average stage length, the average passenger trip length, and the average seats flown per kilometre. And we'll simply be doing this by taking a look at diagrams such as this one, so that we can get to understand how we can get our calculations as accurate as possible. The other thing, of course, is we come up against costs. How do we categorise our costs? And because cost, of course, is going to determine what the price is we're going to be charging. So we'll have things such as administrative cost, which is the overhead cost that we look at within airlines. Then the functional cost, which is what does it actually cost itself from the aircraft point of view to be able to provide that service. And of course, we'll look at different ways of breaking this down. So we can see that we can look at our total operating expenses and break those into total aircraft operating expenses, and we can break those down further into the flying operations, the flight equipment maintenance, that is maintaining our aircraft, and the actual depreciation that we look at there. And then we'll be looking at all those other costs, such as the passenger service itself, the aircraft servicing between legs. We can take a look at all those other things, passenger processing, and we'll be breaking those down so that we get an understanding as to how these costs, all of them individually, contribute to that total operating cost. The one thing that we find is that we can work out average cost breakdowns. And for example, in the United States, the airlines have to provide a Form 41, and this provides a lot of data on the airline's operations itself. And this is taken up by researchers such as Massachusetts Institute of Technology, who provides a lot of the data we used on the course, Boeing itself, and the various aviation periodicals that are put out that help you understand the airline industry. And for example, they tell us that flight operating costs are about 50%, the ground operating costs are about 30%, and the system operating costs, that is those overhead costs that we've got, around about 20%, and they provide a rule of thumb. So it's understanding those figures by themselves that really help us get an understanding, so that we can look at a cost itself and we can say, okay, what's a rule of thumb to break that cost down itself? We'll take a look at graphs, and there are lots of graphs that we'll be studying throughout the course, and they'll help give us an understanding as to the industry in a particular country and how their overall costs are worked out. And then we can look at the costs of the legacies, that is the airlines providing full services shown in the pink here, and then we can look at the low-cost airlines such as we see in the green. And understanding these will give us a very, very good understanding of the overall industry itself. Finally, of course, we come to aircraft productivity. And the one thing that we will be studying is how we can work out what the productivity, that is, how well is the airline actually utilising its aircraft to get the best out of them. And we'll look at the number of departures that they make during the day via the average stage length and the number of seats on board that aircraft. And that shows what the aircraft's generating per day. And we'll look at figures and it'll show how some airlines are getting far more use out of their aircraft than airlines flying exactly the same aircraft. And one of the things that we'll find out is an aircraft sitting on the ground is the most useless asset that you can have in aviation. And we'll see how airlines actually do this. Here is an example. It gives you a feel for a Boeing 737. And we can see here that, for example, Continental Airlines is getting 291,246 air seat kilometres out of theirs, whereas Southwest Airlines is getting nearly 400,000. Virtually an extra 25% out of the same aeroplane. How do they do it? Well, we'll be studying that. And it gives us a very good understanding then as to airlines and predicting their future performance based on their current performance. We'll look at employee productivity. Airlines, we said, are labour intensive. So how do we get the best out of our employees? And we can work that out by simply looking at the air seat kilometres divided by the number of employees. And that gives us a very good feel as to how airlines are getting the best out of their employees. And for example, one of the basic statistics that we'll look at very early in the course is how one airline has 200 people for every aircraft sitting on the line, whereas another airline has 100 people. A huge difference in productivity. But that by itself is not enough. We've got to look at that air seat kilometres, and we'll be calculating that right throughout. So this is a thing. We can look at legacy airlines and how they tend to get better employment, how they get employment compared to the low-cost carriers. And again, what we can see is low-cost carriers very often are able to get much more actually from their workforce than the actual legacy carriers themselves. So in summary, we cover a lot in this particular lecture, and we've just touched upon the tip of it. But it gives you a feel as to how the airlines actually sit down and say, what is it that drives our costs? What are the data that we've got to collect to understand those costs? What are the metrics that we then put that data into? Where are all the costs located, and how can we attribute them and therefore put them into a formula where we can then understand just how well are we using our aircraft, just how well are we using our people to be able to stay competitive compared to another airline who perhaps is not getting the same out of its people or its aircraft. This is going to be a very, very important lecture for understanding the way that airlines operate, and also in doing the assignments where you actually get to apply this knowledge in studying a particular airline. Thank you.